about a cigarette.
When talking about tropes of the James Bond series, elements that are closely associated with the films and the character, the things that spring to mind immediately will likely include vodka martinis, gadgets, fast cars, beautiful women, exotic locations, maniacal villains, and perhaps, at one point, cigarette smoking would have been high on that list too. Heck, in James Bond's first scene in his first movie saying his iconic catchphrase, he does so while taking a drag of a freshly lit cigarette.
Bond. James Bond.
Smoking is generally mentioned and discussed quite regularly in the original Ian Fleming books. The very first line of the very first book contains a reference to smoking. The scent and smoke and sweat of a casino are nauseating at 3 in the morning. Smoking being such a big, let's say, activity for the character on the page, it makes sense that this would be translated to the big screen, if not necessarily quite to the same extent. Towards the end of that first chapter of Casino Royale, it's mentioned that Bond is lighting his 70th cigarette of the day before heading to bed, and that excessive to the extreme consumption is not an isolated incident in the books. Bond smoked so much throughout the novels that it's a wonder he was able to carry out even the most basic of tasks without collapsing into a wheezing heap. It's very well known that Ian Fleming himself was a heavy smoker in real life, and as is the case with a lot of the man's habits, likes and dislikes, this translated into the books as being a habit for Bond as well. There are a lot of mentions of smoking throughout the novels, and in great detail what brand of cigarettes Bond has, where he gets them, times when he has to cut down because he's trying to get himself into a fit enough shape to take part in a particularly grueling mission, and turns out exercise is much easier when you aren't carrying around kilograms of tar in your lungs. Though I do feel that literary Bond, and presumably Fleming's own attitude towards cigarette smoking, can probably be best summed up in this extract from Live and Let Die. You start to die the moment you are born. The whole of life is cutting through the pack with death. So take it easy, light a cigarette, and be grateful you are still alive as you suck the smoke deep into your lungs. First of all, my apologies to any former smokers for who this discussion topic might be particularly triggering, but good evening, Mr. Bond fans. That's Bond on the page, of course, but for the purposes of this video, I wanted to focus on specifically Bond smoking in the film series. And that's because I do think it's interesting to see the depictions of smoking in Bond films over the years and how that very much parallels with wider shifts in smoking in cinema in general, as well as public attitudes towards the habit. And specifically how James Bond has gone from a man who on the page smokes 70 cigarettes a day to a man who has on screen apparently kicked the habit, so much so that he's more than happy to belittle others for indulging.
Filthy habit.
Over the course of the film series' first few installments in the 1960s, it was a common sight to see Bond lighting up in a bar, during dinner, during meetings with nefarious villains, but beyond that, smoking is actually quite relevant to the plots in a few instances, to the extent that it even saves Bond's life. In From Russia with Love, when Bond is being held at gunpoint, it's his request for a final cigarette that triggers Grant's downfall. Bond offers to pay for the opportunity with gold sovereigns, some of which are in Bond's Q branch assigned briefcase, which of course blows up in Grant's face and allows Bond to gain the upper hand in the fight. And in You Only Live Twice, it's Tiger Tanaka's own gadget masters that have installed a tiny rocket into a cigarette that Bond is able to use to facilitate the entry for the ninjas into Blofeld's hollowed-out volcano base. You know, it's only really when you start explaining Bond plots out loud that you start realizing how ridiculously insane some of them are. You Only Live Twice is an interesting one, though, because it features a couple of comments from villains providing somewhat decent advice, actually, regarding the dangers of smoking.
You should give up smoking. Cigarettes are very bad for your chest.
Yes, give him his cigarettes. It won't be the nicotine that kills you, Mr. Bond.
It's the little seen philanthropic side of the Spectre organization. They may want World War III, but they draw a line at cancer. There's also a curious moment, I think, in Thunderball, where the main villain Largo is talking to one of his own henchmen, and specifically about this guy's lack of vices.
Of course, Vargas does not drink, does not smoke, does not make love. What do you do, Vargas? Every man has his passion. Mine is fishing.
I think that these are all quite noteworthy, as it's the villains talking about the dangers of smoking or alluding to the fact that they don't smoke at all, and I assume that this is because smoking rates were still pretty high in the 1960s. It was seen as a very normal, everyday activity. Maybe people were even lighting up cigarettes watching these films in the cinema, so if there's going to be people judging the habit, of course they're going to be villains. Though saying that, we don't actually see Connery's Bond smoking a cigarette in his fourth film, Thunderball, although he is able to use his initiative and get out of a sticky situation with the villains by using Fiona Volpe's lighter to create a distraction, and both villains and allies are seen smoking throughout the film, and in his final Eon-produced Bond film, Diamonds Are Forever, Connery does not smoke at all, despite being in bed with Tiffany Case, who is doing exactly that, post-coitus. This may well have been reflective of Sean Connery's own attempt to kick the habit. In this interview with the Guardian newspaper from 1971 archived on MI6HQ, link below, the actor is quoted as saying, "I gave up smoking 3 years ago, a complete cut-off." And considering the production moved heaven, earth, and mountains of cash to get Connery back for Diamonds Are Forever, I don't suppose that anyone on the production was about to force the actor to smoke for the sake of a scene, when really there are no moments in the film that outright require him to light up, and this laxness, I guess, towards the actor's own smoking or indeed non-smoking habits would continue in a different fashion into Roger Moore's era as well. But just to close the loop on 60s Bond, George Lazenby is seen smoking both cigarettes and a pipe in his single 007 outing. The pipe is a bit of an affectation while the agent is undercover as Sir Hilary Bray, but it's interesting to note that just like Connery, in Lazenby's very first scene as Bond, we see him lighting up a fresh tab. It's almost as if a precedent was being set, like, okay, there's a new Bond, so we obviously have to have him smoking in his first scene. Well, this trend was promptly bucked by Roger Moore, who is not smoking a cigarette in his first scene as Bond, or indeed over the course of his entire tenure. In Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun, we see Bond smoking cigars instead, and this was seemingly entirely brought about because Roger Moore himself did not smoke cigarettes at that point in his life, as he mentions in the audio commentary for The Man with the Golden Gun.
I did not smoke cigarettes. I sadly smoked cigars, which were almost as bad for you as cigarettes. Disgusting habit, and even worse for your neighbours. I don't know whether the idea of having a cigar was mine, or I think I said I don't smoke cigarettes, I don't want cigarettes.
I guess in a way, this kind of sums up the filmmaker's general attitudes towards Bond smoking on screen, and that attitude is kind of a big I bring this up because obviously if you're to take the purist notion of what James Bond on screen should be, and if that is exactly as Ian Fleming wrote it, then yes, this should be a man who is smoking 50, 60, 70 cigarettes a day. And you know, we often talk about how, yeah, the Bond films are set in contemporary times to when they were released, and the times update, but James Bond as a character doesn't necessarily, whereas this is an instance where, yeah, the character has changed in regards to this. And presumably the people making the films didn't care about it all that much, like, oh, okay, the actor doesn't smoke cigarettes, fine, we're not gonna force him. But that won't stop them from getting in cigarettes elsewhere. In The Spy Who Loved Me, Moonraker, and Octopussy, it's the Bond girls who are the cigarette smokers. Well, presumably in Moonraker at least, as Bond peers into Dr. Goodhead's bedside drawer to reveal a conveniently placed pack of Marlboros in there, but that's nothing on the advertising billboards we see later on. Hardly subtle. The company even gets a special thanks mention in the film's credits. But despite that, Bond himself remained personally smoke-free on screen for a good few years until Timothy Dalton took on the role for 1987's Living Daylights, and the hero is once again seen puffing away in some early scenes, and this carries through to License to Kill as well. I guess all that subliminal Moonraker product placement eventually caught on, huh? Though Lark is the brand placement of choice in that particular outing, as Bond uses a Q-branch disguised explosive detonator disguised as a pack of Lark cigarettes, which, funnily enough, both Roger Moore and Pierce Brosnan did ads for the company in the 80s and early 90s, which is kinda nuts.
Speak what?
Anyway, back to Dalton. I think his Bond smoking cigarettes on screen speaks to the broader objective of returning the James Bond character to his Fleming roots in his outings. Dalton in interviews and such speaks quite passionately about representing the character at his most authentic, and cigarette smoking is a big thing for the character on the page, so yeah, we should see that on the screen clearly. This is very much in line with the perception many fans hold of Dalton as being the most true to Fleming Bond we have ever seen on screen, and I'm also one who subscribes to that notion, and yeah, when I think of the Bond of the Ian Fleming stories, I am thinking of a man smoking an awful lot of cigarettes. It is worth noting, though, that the end of License to Kill features a disclaimer in the end credits warning viewers of the dangers of smoking, and really this is indicative of, well, changing social attitudes and understandings of smoking on large, at that point not even 30 years since the James Bond film series started. Smoking rates had been consistently decreasing steadily over the years. The public were more aware of the health risks and dangers associated with cigarette smoking, so it's perhaps no surprise that when James Bond returned to screens in 1995 as Pierce Brosnan in GoldenEye, the character would be, well, smoke-free. The villains are still lighting up though. Xenia Onatopp is seen smoking during the card game with Bond, and then there's Boris Grishenko, who attempts to enjoy a rollie outside his workplace before the plot arrives to interrupt his break. Tomorrow Never Dies released in 1997 and features probably the most anti-smoking messaging of any Bond film since Blofeld and Mr. Osato in You Only Live Twice.
Filthy habit.
And then there's The World Is Not Enough, which features a, I guess, slightly more subtle anti-smoking moment when Bond delivers Moneypenny a cigar that he picked up from his meeting in Bilbao.
I know exactly where to put that.
And sure enough, Brosnan's Bond did not smoke a single cigarette during his entire run as Bond, but in Die Another Day he is seen smoking a cigar. This is after meeting with Raoul, an agent working as a manager for a cigar production factory in Havana. So from a narrative perspective, I guess it makes sense that, yeah, sure, he'd pick up a case. But it also makes sense that, yeah, you know what, this is a film where Bond is held captive for 14 months in North Korea. I'm not gonna begrudge him this particular indulgence. But also, smoking a cigar feels very appropriate in Die Another Day for other reasons. It is, of course, the series' 40th anniversary film, with countless references to other Bond movies and Bond history scattered throughout. The scene features a copy of Birds of the West Indies, written by James Bond, which was, of course, Ian Fleming's source of inspiration when it came to naming his spy for Casino Royale. The scene in which he is smoking is, of course, the famous one where Halle Berry channels Ursula Andress coming out of the sea, as the actress did in Dr. No, too. So the scene is really harkening back to the root of Bond in multiple ways, and the only thing I think would have perhaps been more fitting is if Bond was indeed smoking a cigarette rather than a cigar, but we'll come to why that particular creative decision may have been made in just a little bit. But first I want to talk about our totally smoke-free Bond, Daniel Craig. Over the course of 5 films, James Bond as Daniel Craig does not smoke once, though other characters smoke. Felix Leiter is seen smoking cigars on a couple of occasions, which leads me to a moment in No Time to Die where I think actually Bond smoking a cigar would have been entirely appropriate. There's this thing where Paloma hands Bond a cigar to deliver to Felix, and after Felix receives a fatal gunshot, Bond mentions it as something to rally the CIA agent with.
Paloma, she gave me a cigar for you to smoke, and you were gonna smoke it. Nice.
Felix, of course, dies before he has a chance to do that, though, and later Bond is seen lamenting the death of his friend, holding the cigar case in his hand. Now, I would have totally bought into the idea of Bond smoking the cigar in a later scene as a tribute to his fallen comrade. Heck, it might not have made all that much sense for him to take it along with him to Saffin's Island at the very end of the film, but I think Bond's own death scene would have perhaps had an added layer of poignancy to it had he lit up that very same cigar and started smoking it, knowing that he's going to his death in a matter of moments anyway. So, over the course of nearly 60 years of movies, we have seen a character who smokes quite regularly in his first few installments, at least, to a character that does not smoke at all on screen. And as I say, this evolution of smoking in the Bond films very much parallels with the evolution of smoking in cinema in general. It is, of course, an entirely common sight for much of the first few decades of cinema to see people smoking cigarettes, because, hey, a lot more people smoked in real life too back then, but smoking on film certainly evolved beyond just reflecting real life. It did become a way for the habit to be glamorized, and tobacco companies would work with studios and film stars for advertising purposes. In this article from The Guardian from 2008, discussing a study that revealed how profitable cigarette promotion was for movie stars back in the golden era of Hollywood, it is cited, in 1937 to 8, actors including Gary Cooper, Joan Crawford, Clark Gable, and Spencer Tracy were each paid $10,000 by American Tobacco to promote its Lucky Strike brand. That year, the cigarette company paid film stars $218,750, more than $3 million at today's prices. The report published in the journal Tobacco Control says almost 200 stars, including 2/3 of the top box office actors of the late 1930s and 40s, were contracted to tobacco companies. Now, I don't want to get too far into the weeds on smoking in Hollywood and cinema in general. I'm very much focusing on the Bond films here, but I do think some kind of top-level context is useful when it comes to this discussion. Specifically, the motivations behind why smoking might have appeared on screen, whether that be through sponsorships or whatnot, or whether indeed it just looks very aesthetically pleasing. And if you're a fan of older cinema, much like I am, then yeah, you know what, I can rattle off a dozen or so movies where I think a character smoking a cigarette on screen looks pretty damn cool. Even if the basis of them smoking is a flagrant sort of product placement with an industry flogging death sticks to the masses, you know, Humphrey Bogart still looks really cool in Casablanca. In part, thanks to sponsorships like that, smoking in many ways became a kind of cinematic shorthand for characters who were cool, mysterious, sexy. James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca, Rita Hayworth in Gilda. The list is endless. I'm going to go a little niche with an instance of smoking on screen that has forever stuck with me, and it's Marlene Dietrich at the end of Alfred Hitchcock's film Stage Fright. I don't want to spoil the context of the scene too much, but Dietrich's character is telling a story, having a conversation, and this is the last shot of her character in the film.
Yes, it takes some of them that way.
The smoke billowing out of her mouth, rising in the frame to cover her face. I think it's such a cool shot and a great cinematic moment. And the combination of her with the cigarette, with the smoke, I mean, it's just, she looks incredible here.
There is nothing sexier than smoke billowing proudly out of a woman's hot red, engorged nostrils.
That image will haunt me.
So yeah, when it comes to creating your cool, mysterious, sexy MI6 agent by the name of James Bond, of course he's gonna be smoking. That's what all the cool, mysterious, sexy characters the public love do, so he's gonna fit that mold. Over time, of course, the public became more and more aware of the dangers involved with cigarettes. Smoking rates decreased pretty rapidly over the years. Agencies became involved in regulating how cigarettes are advertised and glamorized over all forms of media, and ultimately the act of cigarette smoking became something else.
They've convicted the tobacco companies without a shred of evidence.
It's the thing people have to go outside to do, because you can't do it in public spaces anymore, and yeah, Casino Royale would have played a little differently if Bond had been nipping around the back of the building to the designated smoking area every 20 minutes, but more so, I just think a lot of public opinion kind of leans on ick when it comes to cigarette smoking these days. It is certainly not seen as an aspirational thing by a majority of people, I don't think, who are more informed about what the habit does to you. Obviously, cigarette smoking has not disappeared from screens entirely, especially if a piece of media is set in the past, but the Bond series has always marketed itself to the mainstream, and if the series is going to continue to be set in contemporary times, I think they're going to continue to reflect the mood of the day regarding smoking. Ergo, Bond will obviously need to smoke a sour cherry-flavoured vape in the next film. I do want to touch on the fact as well that due to health regulations and whatnot, certain territories around the world have different rules regarding showing cigarette smoking in various pieces of media. The conversation seems to pop up every now and then in relation to film classification boards like the MPAA in America and the BBFC in the UK as to whether films that show cigarette smoking should indeed receive higher age ratings. I've brought up this particular anecdote on the channel before, but back when I was in sixth form college here in the UK, my general studies teacher had a cousin that worked at the BBFC, so the Film Classification Board, and she came in to give a little talk to us one week. It was probably the most valuable lesson I had those entire few years. And she was talking about stuff about like how the BBFC you can't see a kid go into a washing machine to like hide in a kid's movie or whatever, and at that time they were super sensitive about headbutts. And I remember it was really cool. She showed us some like deleted material from the Angelina Jolie Tomb Raider movie where they had to remove headbutts to be in line with BBFC guidelines. And smoking came up as a subject of conversation as well, because she said that every now and then the BBFC will receive, they get so many letters about smoking in kids' movies and what have you, even though they're from decades prior, they're still shown on TV these days. So they get letters, and then inevitably they have to have discussions about, okay, is there any action that we as the Film Classification Board have to take? And she said that one of the proposals that has been sort of floating around for a while is that, oh, okay, well, every movie that features a cigarette will automatically get an 18 certificate, which is, you know, pretty much as high as the BBFC can go, meaning that no one under the age of 18 is able to see or buy that particular film. And obviously I put my hand up at this point, because I was kind of like, I think in the UK at that time, I think it's a PG rating now, but at that time Casablanca was rated U. 101 Dalmatians, the classic Disney film, Cruella de Vil's smoking in pretty much every scene she's in, that film is rated U certificate, and I was kind of like, these films are gonna suddenly go from a U rating to an 18 rating, so literally the lowest to the highest. And she said that, well, yeah, ultimately that is why this rule never comes into force, because you do have all of these movies from decades prior that are fine to be U certificate, PG certificate, and what have you, and it's not worth sort of making them so, like every single film prior to 1980 is suddenly going to have a 18 rated certificate because some bloke in the background is like having a cigarette. But I do think that this is worth noting, because there are film classification boards around the world that do have stricter classification rules regarding when smoking is on screen based on whatever rules they have in that country. And obviously Bond films are produced for a mass audience. They're very expensive films to make, and the people making them want to make as much money as possible. They want the biggest audience to see them as can possibly can. And so yeah, is it really worth running the risk that you're going to cut off a huge section of your audience just for the sake of having James Bond smoking a cigarette in a couple of scenes? And even if those rules aren't necessarily in force now, who's to say what they could be in the future? So when they start making the film to when it's released is a good couple of years. So yeah, I'm not surprised that the film studios kind of like pull back from cigarette smoking on screen in that regard, because you don't want to ultimately come out with a film that is suddenly going to have a significantly higher rating and thus cut off a huge chunk of the audience. As I alluded to earlier though, cigar smoking seems to be treated differently, which is why I think we got Bond smoking one in Die Another Day and why Felix smokes them through the Craig era. I guess it's because cigars have never really been an everyday habit for a lot of people, or a multi-everyday habit for a lot of people. They tend to be associated with special occasions and opulence, despite still coming with health risks, of course, but there is much less of a public discourse around cigar smoking in public, for instance. So I think if we are ever gonna see Bond smoke on screen again, I would think it would be another cigar. Just to bring this all back to the root of Bond again, because as I say, I do think, and I've taken part in conversations with people where, there are particular purists who really do think that Bond films should go set back in the 50s and 60s, that Bond should be smoking again and what have you, and I don't know if... I think it would have to be a much smaller project and a much more niche project to see James Bond smoking on screen again, because they ultimately want Bond to be a mass appeal, very aspirational figure, and so that's why some of his vices are kind of pulled back on in a lot of ways. Whether or not that's true to the source material or not, that's what has proven to be very successful on screen, and so I can't see that stopping anytime soon. In terms of whether I would personally want to see James Bond smoking on screen again, I don't suppose it matters to me all that much. Again, as I say, like with No Time to Die, how that film panned out story-wise, there were moments where I thought like, oh, actually this would make a lot of sense if Bond was smoking in this particular situation, but it is not something that I'm going to mark a movie down for, I guess, is where I'm coming from. But I do know a fair few purists out there who would very much like to see that depicted on screen again. Let me know in the comment section below if you're one of those people. I guess that's ultimately the question that I kind of want to end this on. Like, do you think that James Bond should, pick up a pack of cigarettes again in the future? Do let me know below. And while you're down there, there's a variety of links to my various social media pages, and of course the subscribe button and the Mrs. Bell notification button, so be sure to click those to stay up to date on future Bond-related videos that I'm going to be publishing on this channel. And with all that being said, and until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.
Yeah, you're only young once. Why not indulge them, I always say. Oh!